In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the aspirations of people for Singapore after 1945. Now, another meaning for aspirations are hopes. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at what some of the hopes of the people were for Singapore after the Japanese occupation. In this online lecture, I will be doing this online lecture with my computer buddy, who will be reading out the longer parts so that I don't get too tired. Let's begin. We first take a look at the constitutional changes from 1946 to 1959. Don't worry if the terms seem a bit too cheem for you. I'll be explaining them to you in a while. Now, the Japanese occupation had led people to disbelieve the British superiority anymore. Right? They didn't believe that the British was superior to them anymore. And because of that, they had an increase in the desire to govern their own country themselves, meaning to run their own country themselves. The British were aware that they could not govern Singapore in the same way before the Japanese occupation. Thus, they tried to please the local people by introducing constitutional changes that allowed more local people to be involved in the government. Previously, if you recall, local people were not there. While there were some local people in the government, these only made up a very small amount. So what is constitutional? Now, constitutional relates to the Constitution, which is a body of fundamental laws, or in other words, laws used to govern or to control a country. These laws determine the power and duties of the government, as well as guaranteeing certain rights to the people. Now, we move on now to the right to vote. The British introduced limited elections in 1948 that allowed eligible voters to choose their own representatives in the Legislative Council for the first time. Now, what is this Legislative Council? It is basically the body or organization that is responsible for making laws in governing Singapore. So when we talk about the Legislative Council, they are in charge of making laws. Remember that. The representatives in this council would help people to resolve the local issues which they faced. Number 3. There were 3 major elections taking place between 1948 and 1959. The number of eligible voters also increased throughout these elections with the introduction of Citizenship Ordinance in 1957. What is this Citizenship Ordinance? Now, this is a rule or law which basically allowed people who were not born in Singapore to become citizens and basically to have the right to vote. If you remember, before the Japanese occupation, organizations such as the Chinese Chamber of Commerce were fighting or trying to get the British government to allow citizenship for these people. And now we finally have it. Okay, there are several stages of the election process in Singapore, which I'll be telling you in a while. The first is a political party is formed by people who share similar ideas in governing a country. This political party will be involved in elections in order to form part of the government so that it can implement their ideas. Now, before the election, different political parties will organize rallies to share their ideas so that they can gain support from the voters. The candidates in the party will also carry out home visits and walkabouts to gain more support from the people. Now, you'll see a lot of this coming up throughout at the end of the year, so you have a better understanding of the election process. Third, on the day of the election, people cast their vote to the party that they think would best represent their interests. The candidate becomes a representative in the government when he or she wins the majority votes in a geographical area. When the party has the most elected candidates, the party wins the election. With that, we now move on to control over government. Now, the British also allowed the local people to have more control over the government. The British realized that the people wanted to govern their own country. However, they had no intention or they did not want to give up complete control over Singapore. Thus, the British decided to introduce gradual change in order to win the support of the people. So how did the British introduce gradual, that means slow, constitutional change to prepare Singapore for self-government? Well, the British increased the local involvement in the government, the Legislative Council. Can you recall what that organization is for? Constituted of 30 non-officials and 9 officials. For the first time, the non-officials outnumbered the officials in this council. The 9 officials were nominated by the governor. For the non-officials, 6 out of 13 would be elected by the people in the 1948 election. So what was the implication? Or the word implication is just a cheap word for what were the effects of such a thing? Well, the British government still had influence in the Legislative Council, even though there was an increase in local involvement. Next, we now move on to the Randall Constitution. The name Randall is named after a guy. Okay, number 1. The riots in early 1950s had signals to the British telling them, hey, look, the local people are angry. Number 2. In 1953, the British decided to grant more political power to the local people to win their hearts and minds. In July 1953, Sir George Randall, a British diplomat, led a commission to recommend possible changes to the constitution, which is known as the Randall Constitution. A commission refers to a group of people who work on a special task such as this, and constitution, again if you can recall, refers to a set of laws which a government abides by or follows. So what were the features of the Randall Constitution? What changes did it make to the laws? Now, unlike the 1948 election, which saw only 6 out of 21 members being elected by the people, now we see that all 25 members in this assembly would be elected by the people in the 1955 election. The Randall Constitution also recommended limited self-government, meaning that only the less important areas of government would be controlled by the local representatives. Now, what do you mean by less important? Well, less important areas basically refer to housing, health, trade, industry, and education. Now, the British still held on to the more important areas of government through the nominated British ministers. These areas included internal security, meaning referring to the police, etc., external defense, law, finance, and external affairs. This showed that they were still not willing to give up their power. Number 4. The Randall Constitution served as an important step to self-government in Singapore. There were more political parties, sorry about that mistake, spelling error, formed to participate in the election in 1955. So, there were basically 2 factors that led to the British to introduce constitutional changes. What actually forced them to change their mind about Singapore? There must have been something. There are basically two main developments, external and internal. We'll first deal with the external developments. There were two external developments that influenced the British to make constitutional changes in Singapore. First would be more European colonial territories in Asia were gaining independence, okay, and they were forced to. It was only a matter of time before Singapore would be independent too. Secondly was the rise of communism after World War II. Now, many Asian countries previously under the colonial rule had gained independence. This signaled the end of colonial rule in Asia. So, what were some of these examples of countries that had gained independence from the British colonial rulers? First, we have India, being the largest British colony, which gained independence in 1947. The Republic of Indonesia gained independence from the Dutch in 1949. Vietnam gained independence from the French in 1954. So we see here a trend of Southeast Asian countries slowly gaining independence. Number 3. The rise of communism after World War II also influenced greatly on the British to make constitutional changes in Singapore. So, for this part, I will get my computer buddy to read it out to you, to explain to you what communism is. Computer buddy, take it away.
What is communism? A 19th century German philosopher named Karl Marx started the idea of communism. In communist ideas, the wealth and resources in a country belong to the government. No one could own a business. The goods are given to people according to their needs. However, the rise of communism clashed with the system of capitalism. The capitalists believe that people can own businesses to gain private profits and enjoy free competition. In 1917, Russia established the system of communism successfully after 2 revolutions. Since then, Russia helped to set up communist parties in different parts of the world. In 1922, together with other neighboring communist states, Russia formed the Soviet Union. This resulted in a spread of communism, and the communist parties were founded successfully in many parts of the world. For example, the Malayan Communist Party, MCP, was set up in Malaya and Singapore. With the successful spread of communism throughout the world after World War II, the world had divided into 2 prominent groups and faced intense rivalry. One that supported the communism led by the Soviet Union, and the other that supported capitalism led by the United States. Both of the systems tried to influence the other countries with their own ideology and feared the other system would become more dominant. This had caused the Cold War between countries that supported these 2 different ideologies to develop after World War II. The Cold War is the name given to the relationship that developed primarily between the USA and the Soviet Union after World War II due to the clash of very different beliefs and ideology: capitalism versus communism.
Thank you, computer buddy. You have a very wonderful British accent. Now, I'll explain the last portion of the lecture, which is basically describing how the rise of communism influenced the British to make constitutional changes in Singapore. Now, the British was anti-communist and worried that Malaya and Singapore would fall under the influence of communism in their struggle for independence. This fear was heightened after the Communist Party took control of China in 1949. The British worried that some Chinese immigrants would help to spread communism in these 2 colonies. The MCP, or Malayan Communist Party, managed to win over support from some people who believed that communism could help to end the British rule, as the party was previously involved in resisting the Japanese under the name of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. So this MCP proved to be very popular with the people, as after all they did manage to drive out the Japanese. Next, to threaten the end of the British rule, the MCP attacked rubber plantations and tin mines belonging to the British in Malaya. It then stirred up workers' and students' feelings against the British in Singapore by spreading their influence to the trade unions and the Chinese medium schools. The British had to declare emergency in order to bring back order to Malaya and Singapore. Now, all this chaos prompted the British to introduce constitutional changes in Malaya and Singapore to ensure that the government in these two colonies was formed by non-communist members. Next, we take a look at internal developments. After the Japanese occupation, the rise of political consciousness among the local people was felt in Malaya and Singapore. Many people had started to doubt the superiority the British had, as the British had failed to prevent the Japanese armies from occupying Malaya and Singapore and caused them to live in harsh conditions during the Japanese occupation. They felt that the British were not capable of ruling Singapore. 3. Since the 1950s, most people in Singapore were born locally. They started to show interest in the matter of governing Singapore, and they were aware that Singapore could be governed by their own people because other colonies had already gained independence. By the 1950s, more political groups were formed to decide the political future of Singapore and push the British colonial government for political changes. And that brings me to the end of part 1 for this lecture. Thank you.